If this is the first time that you've been on my channel, thanks for stopping by. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. I think that today we're gonna take a look at some of my recent reads, and I'm gonna recommend some books for you depending on the kind of things that you like to read. I tend to find that I read a lot of non-fiction books. I do read some fiction as well, but a lot of the books that I read tend to be about humankind, who we are, where we come from, why we do the things that we do, why we feel the things that we feel. And there may be some books in here in my pile that I can recommend to you that you may find interesting or compelling, or may give you kind of context around your own life and where you fit into the world. So the first book I have is Notes on a Nervous Planet by Matt Haig. And if you don't know Matt, he is a British author who has a history of writing about his struggles with depression and anxiety, which is something that I've had issues with myself, and over time I've learned how to handle that and how to be better about dealing with it as a factor of my life. And Matt wrote this book as a way of articulating that these problems that we all have in one way or another are actually quite common. And that's what Notes on a Nervous Planet is. And it was gifted to me by my friend Amy, who said that she found it very beneficial for herself and that she greatly enjoyed reading it and finding reassurance that some of the things that she feels and the way that she approaches things in the world is perhaps more common than she realized. What if the way we live was engineered to make us unhappy? And what if there was something that we could do about it? I remember when I first read the book, I was in a pretty depressive space, and I wasn't sure about a lot of things in life, and I was younger and quite unsure about how to navigate some of those feelings. And it wasn't really until I had read this that I felt like there was context in a lot of the way that I felt about things. Because the book goes into details about how the modern world functions, and there's a lot of information about how the systems of the world, particularly in our modern digital, always-on lifestyle, make us feel worse than we need to. And having finished the book, I actually deleted Instagram and Facebook and those kind of services, mostly to give myself a mental kind of break. And that was very beneficial. I don't think the book changed my life by any means, but it opened a door for me that I hadn't previously gone through, which was that I felt nervous about reading, these kind of books. Self-help books, books around psychology, books around how really just to improve your life. I think I was nervous about revelations or work that would have to follow through from these. But I found it beneficial, and I found that in some ways it was comforting to know that much of the things that I feel are not unique. And that relates to my next book, which is by a friend of mine named Erica. And this is a book called This Party's Dead by Erica Bwist. And Erica's theory is that a lot of the anxiety and unsureness we feel about ourselves is predominantly a Western problem. It's something that's increasingly found throughout Europe and North America. And that's not to say, of course, that you can't find this in every part of the world in one way or another. But it is to say that there is possibly a link between a lot of our Western anxieties and the lifestyles that we live. And so Erica went on trips around the world to various festivals and days of mourning and other events themed around death to investigate her hypothesis that much of our anxiety in the West is because we have an unhealthy relationship with death, and that we're afraid of having lives not properly lived, or never amounting to anything, or having fear of missing out on a lifetime span, not just one evening or one weekend, but all the things that we may not accomplish in the time that we have on the earth. And so she traveled to Mexico for the Day of the Dead celebrations. She traveled to East Asia to investigate how they engage in funerals and mourning and loss and grieving. And she largely proved herself correct, I believe, in some ways. I think it's the sort of thing that requires additional investigation in an academic sense. But it's something that is worth pondering, that if the nature of how we live our lives in the West is part and parcel of the issues that we experience. And then this is a book that I reread, actually, I think for the third time, and this is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, who is an Israeli academic and professor. believe he's a professor at the University of Tel Aviv. And in Sapiens, it really is a micro, or I guess a macro overview of humanity from our early beginnings as part of a broader tree of humanity known as the Homo sapiens, of which we are still a part of course. But really it's an investigation into who we are and where we've come from, and relating to these two other books, it gives context of how we've evolved and how in many ways we have outgrown our biology. Because he argues that there's many systems that we have within our brain that are designed to keep us alive, to keep us alert, that from millennia ago, had integral uses and were very important. I think he refers to something called the hunter-gatherer part of our brain, and dopamine, and how dopamine makes us be driven to obtain something, and then we experience the reward of having obtained it. And how in our modern world much of those systems have been hijacked by technology that exploits much of that neurochemistry that we have built into our systems. And I found that very interesting to consider, that really we aren't all that different to what we used to be. And I think that there's an assumption that humans from 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago, or 10 million ago were significantly different. But they weren't. They felt much the same things that we feel. They thought in similar kind of ways. Their technology wasn't anywhere near what it is today, of course. But the reality is that what we are hasn't fundamentally changed for a long time. And it wasn't until around 10,000 years ago, at the advent of the agricultural revolution, when we started to farm and to use nature in the way that we wanted, rather than the other way around. It wasn't until then, really, that we saw this advancing use of technology to make the world work to how we wanted to, and for us to benefit from that. And in Sapiens, we really talk about how that process started and how it has continued ever since, and how in knowing much of this and how we've evolved and how we've changed, you can almost empower yourself to be cognizant of your own behaviors. When the part of your brain that says you want something that's high in calories and sweet and sugary is triggered, you'll know from reading this that once upon a time, and still today, our brains associate high-calorie foods and sugar with a sense of richness and fullness. And when we lived in scarcity and didn't have access to rich foods with high fat and salt and protein content, that the opportunity to indulge on things like raspberries or strawberries and other naturally found high calorie or at least high sweetness foods was rare. And so when we found it, we did that. But now we don't have that scarcity, at least not in the Western world. And hopefully, in time, in the developing world, that will be resolved as well. It's one of my favorite books because it is so reassuring to know that we're part of a long, very long history of humans that have come before us, and that we are just a stepping stone between what has come before and what will come after. So the next book is Barack Obama's biography, which, in a bit of a change of tone, I enjoyed a lot, but it wasn't what I wanted. I am 32, and so I imagine, how old would I have been when Obama won the first election? I guess, like 16, I guess, ish. No. I can't think because I'm trying to concentrate on this, but somebody will correct me in the chat. I was old enough that Obama was my first kind of president that I remember. And of course, I remember George Bush. I remember Bill Clinton. But I believe that when I was of kind of an age of understanding how things in the world worked, Barack Obama was running for president. And it was a very interesting time when you consider it in hindsight to where we are now. Because Barack Obama really campaigned on hope and change and progressive values, which for me is something that I personally align with. And I accept that, some people listening to this may not feel the same way, and that's okay. You're very much entitled to your own opinions about things in the same way that I am. But it was significant for me because I didn't really remember much about the Bush presidency, but I do remember things like 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I remember how much they impacted society in one way or another. And so when I started to take an interest in politics, and I started learning more about this man from Chicago called Barack Obama, who at the time I believe was the junior senator, I was pretty fascinated. We were learning about civil rights in school, and we were learning about how difficult it has been for the black population in America to establish themselves and to be treated as equal citizens in the country. And the idea that whilst learning about these things, there was this black American man from a single mum, from a working class family, with a Kenyan father who was doing pretty well in the polls. At the time, Hillary Clinton was also running, and she was expected to be the Democratic Party's nominee, and she wasn't. She was bested by Barack Obama. And as we all kind of know, the rest is history. The book was interesting because it came out at the same sort of time as his wife, Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, which I have to admit I haven't read, but I know people who have read it, and they recommend it a lot. And I'm sure that one day I will get around to reading it. But it was interesting because it didn't really talk about the things that I thought it would. There was some insight into Barack Obama as an individual and to what compels him. But I think where I had a revelation was that people like Barack Obama don't often second guess themselves. And so I think I was intrigued to read the book and think, why is this person the way they are? Why do they think the way they think? Why do they feel the way they feel? And there is that. There is Barack Obama talking about how he's come to conclusions about things. And there is context of how he's been brought up and what he cares about. But I would say that there wasn't too much depth into him analysing himself of why he cares about these things. I think some of the larger things when it comes to issues like civil rights are more obvious. But one thing I was particularly interested to know is, why did Barack Obama think he would be the person to fix some of these problems? But maybe that will be in the second book, because this is the first one. The first of a 2-volume series. But this has been a while actually since this came out. I think it was, let me see if I can find a date. I'm stood up, so finding the right angle to do this is tricky. Okay, so it came out in 2020. It feels longer than that, actually. But maybe it's because I'm thinking of when he left office in 2016. And that leads me on to my final recommendation. Animal Farm by George Orwell. I remember when I first read Animal Farm, it wasn't that long ago. It was 2016, I think. And I'd come across it in school, and, everybody has a copy, right? And everybody knows of it. They know of George Orwell, whether from 1984 or from Animal Farm and his other works. But I remember being shocked when I read it, because I think for a long time I knew my own political leanings, and I knew how I felt about things and how I felt about the systems that govern the world. And I remember reading Animal Farm, and it felt like everything was articulated in this book. And I'll give you a rough overview, at least of the first part, because I don't want to spoil the book. I think it's worth reading. But the setting is that there is a farm, and it serves as a social commentary of the world. And it has the famous line that some animals are more equal than others, with the idea being that to an extent we tell ourselves that we are all equal and that we all deserve the same sort of things, but that isn't always something that is reflected in reality. In fact, the first quote on the back is, "All animals are created equal, but let me reread that. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." I'll keep reading. Revolution is in the air at Manor Farm after Old Major, a prize boar, tells the other animals about his dream of freedom and teaches them to sing Beasts of England. Mr. Jones, the drunken farmer, is deposed and a committee of pigs takes over running the farm. The animals are taught to read and write, but the dream turns sour, the purges begin, and those in charge become more and more to resemble their oppressors. And it goes on to say that it's allegorical of the Soviet Revolution, but remains as lucid and compelling as ever. I think it's a fundamental book that everybody should read once in their life. And I've considered maybe reading it on my channel if that's something that would interest people. And I promise to do it without tripping up on the words like I just did. But let me know in the comments below if any of these books are your favourites too, or if any of them sound like something that you would be interested in reading. Reading is something that's particularly important to me, and I find that it's my personal way of contextualizing my own life amongst the lives of others around the world. And if you'd be interested in starting an ASMR reading club or something similar, please let me know below and we can chat. But for now, thank you for tuning into this, and if you have any book recommendations to share with me, I very much encourage you to do so. Thanks.